What happens when one of the world's most controversial ancient books collides with a conversation that millions of people are watching? What happens when a discussion about forgotten giants, mysterious beings, and humanity's hidden origins suddenly challenges everything people think they know about history, religion, and truth? Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Truth Narrator, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. If you're fascinated by mysteries that blur the line between history and legend, you're in the right place. The studio lights glowed softly. The microphones were live. Millions of listeners were tuning in. At first, it seemed like just another podcast conversation. But within minutes, the discussion would take a turn that would leave audiences stunned, spark fierce debates online, and reopen questions that have haunted humanity for centuries. The host leaned back in his chair. His guest sat across from him, calm and confident. Between them rested a subject so controversial that many religious scholars had spent decades arguing about it. The Book of Enoch, a text surrounded by mystery, a book mentioned by ancient believers, a book quoted by early religious figures, a book that somehow never became part of the biblical canon accepted by most churches. The host looked directly at his guest. "So let me ask you something," he said. "If this book was known to ancient believers, why isn't it in the Bible today?" The room became quiet. The guest smiled, not because the question was simple, but because he knew exactly how explosive the answer could be. "That's a question, isn't it?" he replied. "Maybe it wasn't removed because it was meaningless. Maybe it was removed because it was too difficult to explain." The host raised an eyebrow. The audience listening around the world leaned closer. The guest continued. "The Book of Enoch tells a story that doesn't fit neatly into traditional explanations. It talks about beings called Watchers descending to Earth. It talks about them interacting with humanity. It talks about knowledge being given to humans." The host interrupted. "And that's where people start getting uncomfortable." "Exactly," the guest replied, "because suddenly you're dealing with ideas that challenge established narratives." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence itself felt heavy. Then the host asked the question everyone was thinking. "Do you believe any of it actually happened?" The guest paused, not for dramatic effect, but because he understood the weight of the question. Outside the studio, listeners were already flooding social media with reactions. Some called the Book of Enoch fascinating. Others called it dangerous. Many had never even heard of it before. Yet now millions were listening to a conversation that was pulling a forgotten text back into the spotlight. The guest finally answered, "I think ancient myths often contain pieces of truth." The host leaned forward. "What kind of truth?" The guest folded his hands. "Human beings have a habit of preserving memories through stories. The details change. The language changes. But sometimes the core event remains." The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer just a discussion about religion. It was becoming a debate about history itself. The host nodded slowly. "So you're saying these stories could be distorted memories of real events?" "Possibly." The guest's answer was careful, yet it carried enormous implications. The host stared at him. "And what if people don't like that possibility?" The guest laughed softly. "Truth has never needed popularity." The words hit like a thunderclap. Almost immediately, clips from the conversation began spreading across the internet. People argued. Experts disagreed. Comment sections exploded. But inside the studio, the conversation was only getting started. The host reached for another topic, one that was even more controversial. The Nephilim, giants, ancient beings described in old texts, creatures that many dismiss as myths. "What do you think they were?" the host asked. The guest looked thoughtful, moments where progress seemed to accelerate dramatically. The host listened carefully. Then he asked a question that changed everything. "Are you suggesting outside intervention?" The guest didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at the host. And for a moment, the room felt frozen. Every listener was waiting. Every viewer was anticipating. Every skeptic was preparing a rebuttal. Finally, the guest spoke. "I'm suggesting we shouldn't assume we already know everything." The statement sounded simple, yet it landed with tremendous force. Because uncertainty can be more powerful than certainty. Questions can be more dangerous than answers. The host nodded slowly. Then he smiled. You know people are going to lose their minds over this conversation. The guests smiled back. They probably already are. And they were. Across social media, debates were erupting. Some viewers called the discussion enlightening. Others accused the speakers of spreading speculation. Experts began weighing in. Influencers started posting reactions. Even people who had never cared about ancient history suddenly wanted to know more. But the most shocking part was still ahead, because the conversation was about to move beyond ancient books and forgotten legends. It was about to challenge humanity's understanding of itself. And when that happened, the tension inside the studio would reach an entirely new level. The questions were becoming bigger. The answers were becoming riskier. And neither man seemed willing to back away. To be continued in part 2. The studio had changed completely. What began as a discussion about an ancient text was turning into something much larger. The host could feel it. The guest could feel it. And judging by the flood of reactions pouring in online, millions of viewers could feel it too. The host leaned forward and tapped the table lightly. "So let me get this straight," he said. "You're saying that throughout history, people may have recorded real events inside stories that later generations dismiss as myths?" The guest nodded. "I'm saying that's happened many times before." The host stared at him. "Give me an example." The guest smiled. "Troy." The host immediately understood. "For centuries, people thought it was a legend." "Exactly," the guest replied. "Then archaeologists found evidence that the city actually existed." The room fell silent. The point was impossible to ignore. History was filled with things once considered impossible until evidence emerged. The host folded his arms. "But that doesn't mean every ancient story is true." "No," the guest agreed, "but it means we should be careful before dismissing them completely." The tension grew stronger, because now they were stepping into dangerous territory. The line between skepticism and curiosity, between accepted knowledge and forbidden questions. The host looked directly into his guest's eyes. "What do you think frightens people more? The possibility that these stories are false, or the possibility that some of them might be true?" The guest laughed softly. "I think uncertainty frightens people." The answer hung in the air. Outside the studio, comments were exploding across social media. Some viewers praised the conversation for encouraging open-minded thinking. Others accused the speakers of challenging established beliefs. The debate was becoming fierce, and it was only getting started. The host glanced at a monitor showing live audience reactions. Thousands of comments were appearing every minute. One side demanded evidence. The other side demanded answers. The guest noticed the screen and smiled. "Look at that." The host nodded. "People are passionate." "Because these questions touch something deep," the guest replied. "Questions about where we came from. Questions about who we are." The host paused. Then he introduced another controversial subject: human evolution, ancient human species, lost chapters of history. The audience immediately sensed where the conversation was heading. "We keep discovering things that rewrite our understanding of humanity," the host said. "Exactly," the guest answered. "Every decade, new discoveries force us to update old assumptions." The host leaned closer. "So what happens if future discoveries challenge even more what we think we know today?" The guest smiled. "Then science does what science is supposed to do." "And what's that?" "It adapts." The answer drew a wave of reactions online. Some applauded, others criticized, but nobody was ignoring the discussion anymore. The conversation had become impossible to look away from. Then came the moment that changed everything. The host asked a question so direct that even the guest seemed surprised. What if ancient people witnessed something extraordinary and simply lacked the words to describe it? The studio became silent. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The audience waited. The tension was almost unbearable. Finally, the guest answered, "Then history may be filled with descriptions that we're still trying to decode." The host slowly leaned back. A chill seemed to pass through the room, because suddenly every ancient mystery felt different. Every forgotten story, every unexplained legend, every strange text buried beneath centuries of debate. The questions were multiplying faster than the answers, and as the discussion moved toward its most explosive conclusion, one thing was becoming clear. The conversation had stopped being about the Book of Enoch. It had become a conversation about humanity itself. And in Part 3, the fallout from these shocking claims would ignite a firestorm across media, experts, and millions of viewers around the world. The moment the episode ended, the silence lasted only seconds. Then the internet exploded. Clips from the conversation spread across social media like wildfire. Short excerpts were shared millions of times. Reaction videos appeared within hours. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Some viewers called the discussion one of the most fascinating conversations they had ever heard. Others accused the speakers of pushing speculation too far. But one thing was undeniable. Everyone was talking about it. News outlets began covering the controversy. Podcast hosts debated the claims. Content creators rushed to publish breakdowns and analyses. The discussion had escaped the studio and entered the global conversation. Back in private, the host sat scrolling through thousands of comments. Some praised him for asking difficult questions. Others criticized him for giving controversial ideas a platform. The screen refreshed constantly. Every second brought hundreds of new reactions. Meanwhile, the guest found himself at the center of a growing storm. Interview requests flooded in. Supporters called him courageous. Critics called him reckless. The pressure was mounting from every direction. Yet despite the chaos, neither side was backing down. Days later, another television host addressed the controversy. Holding up a tablet filled with headlines, he shook his head. How did a conversation about an ancient book become the biggest debate on the internet? Across the world, millions wondered the same thing. Perhaps it was because the discussion touched something deeper than history. It touched identity. People want answers. People want certainty. People want to know where humanity came from and where it is going. When those questions are challenged, emotions naturally follow. As experts weighed in, some argued that ancient text should be understood symbolically. Others insisted that legends often preserve fragments of historical memory. The arguments continued day and night. Neither side could fully convince the other, and perhaps that was a point. One evening, the host reflected on the interview during another episode. He looked directly into the camera. "You know what's interesting?" he said. "It wasn't the answers people reacted to." He paused. It was the questions. Those words resonated with viewers everywhere, because the interview had done something rare. It had made people think. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone believed the same conclusions. But millions had been inspired to ask questions they had never considered before. Questions about history. Questions about religion. Questions about human origins. Questions about how much remains unknown. Weeks passed. The controversies slowly evolved into something larger than a single podcast episode. Universities discussed it. Online communities dissected every statement. Books that had sat untouched on shelves suddenly surged in popularity. Ancient mysteries once ignored were being discussed by a new generation. And through it all, one reality remained. The truth is often complicated. Sometimes history is clear. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes certainty exists. And sometimes all we have are clues scattered across time. The host and his guest never claimed to possess every answer, but they had opened a door that many people had been afraid to approach. As the debate continued, one final question lingered in the minds of viewers around the world. What if some mysteries survive not because they cannot be solved, but because humanity has not yet learned how to solve them? The camera slowly faded to black. The discussion was over, but the questions remained. And perhaps they always will. Now it's your turn. What do you think about the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim, and the mystery surrounding humanity's ancient past? Do you believe these stories contain hidden truths, or are they simply myths passed down through generations? Share your opinion in the comments below. Your perspective could become part of the next big discussion. And if you enjoyed this dramatic story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Truth Narrator, and turn on notifications so you never miss another explosive story, shocking confrontation, or mystery that challenges everything we think we know. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep searching for the truth.